Ready to go without my glasses. I got this. Welcome.
Don't press the date first.
Ella. Alrighty. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day, everybody. I'm going to start with introducing myself. I am Maria Barone, and I am a member of the FOAM board. And it's exciting that we are continuing our presentations this year, since we didn't for a few years. I do want to start with the WIOT land acknowledgement. The Arcata Marsh and Wildlife Sanctuary is located on the unceded land of the WIOT people, who continue to remain in relationship to these lands through ceremony, culture, and stewardship. They are important parts of the history and continuing knowledge of this place. It was a little typo. In general, let's appreciate the land that way. So this evening we have Dave Couch with us. He is the FOAM Vice President and the retired wastewater treatment plant operator, and so many other wonderful things. And Dave, we appreciate you coming to talk with us about oysters. And this was strategically scheduled in time so that we all know more about oysters if we attend the Oyster Festival, just in about a week and a half. So without further ado, here's Mr. Dave Couch, and thank you so much.
Okay, can you hear me? Is that working? Okay, well,
You need Mark to answer.
Yes, it is affirmative.
Okay.
this is the,
Don't shine it in your eyes.
okay. So anyway, this is just kind of a cutaway diagram of an oyster that kind of shows its internal organs and everything. The gonadal tissue would cover this whole area if it wasn't a drawing showing all the internal organs. And so basically an oyster is going to be hanging out. The gills are going to be beating and providing oxygen, but that also acts as kind of a food sorting mechanism. So excuse me, algae or phytoplankton that's in the water, the gills are going to sort that out and kind of bring it along over here to the palp area, and then the palps are going to sort what's edible phytoplankton versus what's non-edible. Could be clay, pieces of debris, whatever's in the water, and then they're going to eat stuff that's edible, and the stuff that's not edible is going to be made into little packets called pseudofeces, and then those are extruded, and then whatever the oyster eats goes through its internal and then gets extruded as feces. And let's see, what else did I want to say about this? Did I talk about the gonadal tissue?
That it would normally be covering.
Yeah, that would normally cover this whole area. And the gonadal tissue varies in an oyster, kind of the thickness of it and the quantity of it, depending about the time of the year. So now this time of year, when the water gets warm, all the gonadal tissue would get converted to gametes, either sperm or eggs, and the oyster, when they spawn, would extrude those. The rest of the year, though, it just kind of builds up. So people talk about oysters and not eating them, and or you should eat them in months that have an R in them. So that's like September through April, and those are kind of cool water times when that gonadal tissue is built up and the oyster is accumulating sugars in that gonadal tissue, and then when they spawn in the summertime, they use that all up. So summertime is not, that's why, you know, you're supposed to eat oysters in months that have an R in them. So that just gets you away from that. Okay.
You eat everything, right? Gonads.
Yeah, you just eat, pop the whole thing in your mouth, depending on if it's a little bitty one, you know, I kind of like little ones that you can just slide down, or Pacifics, you know, they'll get this big, so that's a bit much to eat, I think. So anyway, here's a kind of a picture of a diagram of a life cycle of oysters. So we're starting out over here with the fertilized egg and then going through different sides of veligers, which are going to be free swimming organisms, part of the zooplankton component of the water. So this is an oyster shell with spat on it. After the oysters go through the final stage of being a swimming, they'll become a settling and a crawling pediveliger, and then that'll set onto like an oyster shell, and they'll actually form another little shell. And then when 1 to 3 years, they'll be an adult and they'll spawn, and the cycle will start over again. And here's some oyster spawning. Here's oyster spawning that are in the environment. You can see how they can impact the water quality, but they produce so much spawn. And there's what a baby oyster, a veliger, looks like, and they go through, you know, like about a month to 6 weeks of different stages of veligers where they're free swimming parts of the zooplankton, and that allows them to disperse and you know, fill an area. And there's kind of a difference, and there's 2 main genuses of oysters that are commercially grown. So one genus are Austria oysters, and that's like Austria edulis, which is a eastern edible oyster, or we have out here Austria luridus, a local oyster that's found on the west coast. So the Austria oysters are brooding oysters. So after they spawn, they retain the larvae inside their mantle cavity to protect them and keep them from getting washed away. And that's just kind of a survivable thing. Whereas Crass Austria oysters, which are like Eastern oysters or Japanese oysters or Crass Austria gaigus, they just put all their gametes out of the water column, and then the oyster larvae are free swimming in the water column and tend to have a longer, you know, get dispersed more. So those are oyster larvae. So here's some little what are called spat-sized oysters. So these are larvae that have settled out. This is cultured in a lab. They would normally be glued onto a surface or another shell, but these are little free-swimming guys that have been grown in a lab, and those are probably a couple of months old after settling out. Hey, so we're going to look at some different species. It's our native oyster in Austria lurida, I believe, and that's what's found here in native in Humboldt Bay, native all the way from southeast Alaska to Baja California. And our initial oyster on the west coast was based on harvesting Olympia oysters, and they kind of became Olympia oysters because that's the center of culture for them. When they were originally classified, they were actually California oysters, but nobody calls them California oysters. Everybody calls them Olympia oysters. So I don't know why that is. And let's see. I think that's a Japanese oyster, a little bit longer, would be a little bit bigger in size. Japanese oysters are, whereas the native oysters are Austria. This is a Crass Austria species, which I mentioned a little bit earlier. That's another Crass Austria there. Let's see. Here are some larva oysters. These are what are called trophophores. So they're just about ready to settle out of the swimming component of the oyster larva.
So they don't have a shell there.
They do have a tiny, if you can kind of see like that area.
Okay.
There is a little shell there, but you know, organisms that feed on them just crunch them up and grind them. It's not like a hard shell, but they do have a layer of a shell. So here we are looking at Arcata Bay. And let's see, this is, I think, a 1930 something view of Humboldt Bay with a different. Arcata's not very big back then. This is the old Arcata wharf going out. This is the oyster area, culture area that's behind Bray Cut. And these are just other oyster growers that were in the bay back in the 1930s. And here's one of those, here's a 1932, this is a diked bed, and this is actually the diked bed that's over behind Bray Cut. You guys know where Bray Cut is, where the
Midway.
Midway, yeah. And so if you look out behind that, you can kind of still see that outline of that oyster dike there. And they just built oyster dikes to have a little bit of a standing water area for the oysters. So they would grow a little bit faster that way. In southern Puget Sound, they really do intensive diking, and Humboldt Bay was kind of started a little bit after the southern Puget Sound, so they tried to do the same thing, but because the tidal tourism here isn't as big as it is up in Washington, the dikes weren't as successful here as they were in Washington State. And this is downtown Eureka. This is the Oyster Shack from the 1930s when they actually did some research in Humboldt Bay. And so this would be sacks of oyster shells. You'd put those out in the bay, oyster larvae would set on them, and then you would spread those around where you wanted oysters. I just thought it was cool that there was oyster research in the 1930s in Humboldt Bay.
Tiny,
Tiny little shack. And so these are some oyster collectors, which is what they would have been making out behind that shack. So these are just pieces of wood, kind of a wood frame, and then they would smear liquid concrete over that. So you'd have a concrete layer. Oysters like to settle out on something that has like a calcium carbonate base. So that's like an oyster shell is calcium carbonate, and they really like to settle on other oyster shells. But you can fool them by putting concrete over a board. So that's what all this is. And this is all you can see how many oyster have settled on that after it's been out in the bay for a while. So here we go, data from the 1930s from Humboldt Bay. And this is showing periods when there was spat settlement in the bay. And I guess this is on some kind of it was on those boards I showed earlier. This is per unit effort. So you can see there's kind of a variation. Some years there's different periods. This was a really good year for settlement. This is counting oysters that have settled out on a substrate, and this year not so much settlement. That's typical, it just shows the variation from years to years and how the oysters do in the bay and their reproductive success.
And those are the months without the arbs.
Yes, yeah, so you'd see it's June, July, maybe starting a little bit in May and carrying through the summer. So all that I was talking about were native oysters. So this is what they began to do here was the native oysters didn't always spawn too well. You remember when I was showing that previous graph, some years were good, some years were not so good. So all the oyster growers wanted to come up with, a guaranteed way to get baby oysters. So they brought in Japanese oysters, which of course, they call them Jap oysters here. I think this would have been a period in time when we had some prejudice working around here. But this was probably in the 30s. So here's another thing. This is bringing in oysters to plant in the bay. So here's a ship, and these were usually log boats or log ships. So they would sail to Japan with logs on them. Japanese like to get whole logs. They didn't like milled lumber because they milled it on a metric system, and we were able to do that. So we always shipped logs to Japan, and then the ships would come back empty, unless they could have crates of oysters on there, or crates of oyster stat. So this would be crates with shells with baby oysters on them, and they would just pump seawater over them and kind of keep them wet, and they would actually survive and make it here. So this is the Miyagi, Japan, oyster getting prepared. Same thing down here. Women actually sorting the shells and piles of shells there. Hey, here's a collection rack, and this is in Kumamoto. Everybody's heard about Kumamoto oysters now, very popular. So this would have been collecting oysters in Kumamoto, Japan. Racks there. I think this is, I can't tell if that's racks or floating beds, but anyway, these are just both shells that are in bags and put out so the baby oyster larvae will settle on them, and then you'll have shells with oysters growing on them. So here's just kind of a map of Japan showing seed producing areas. And some of them would be, like this is relatively northern Japan, all the way down here to Kumamoto, which is southern Japan. So there might, Kumamoto oysters are actually a different species. Most oysters from Japan are Crass Austria gigas, is what's called the Japanese or the Pacific oyster. They're originally the Japanese oyster, and then around wartime we changed them to Pacific oysters. And anyway, northern areas, southern areas, Kumamoto, of course, that's where the Kumamoto oysters come from, which are a different species, and they're Crass Austria talkentensis. And since they're down here in the southern part, they're almost tropical. And so they're kind of a preferred species now, because oysters spawn based on the temperature of the water. So these southern oysters, it hardly gets warm enough here for them to spawn. So that's why everybody is kind of switching to grow to Kumamoto oysters now, because you can grow them and harvest them in the summer, or Pacific oysters, which might come from up here. They're gonna like spawn out in the summertime. And so that nice gonadal tissue I showed you earlier on the outside, it's gonna all get converted into sperm and eggs, and then the oyster is going to kind of be watery. So that's why people used to say, don't eat oysters if the mouth doesn't have an R in it. That was just a way to say you wouldn't eat oysters in the summertime when they were spawned or spawning out. And I already had that picture. Did I go forward? Okay. So here we are in Humboldt Bay, actually. And these are racks of oysters. Some of these are oyster dredges that have been, so this is oyster shells that have been shucked at the oyster. This would be what is turned into coast oyster. I don't know what it was back then, but they would shuck the oysters, save the shells. So shells would go out on a barge, and then they would be spread in the bay. There's somebody shucking oysters. And here, this is another picture of oysters getting shucked. So in the old days, they didn't sell a lot of oysters in the half shell, just because there wasn't shipping. So almost all the oysters, maybe until mid 1970s or so, there would have been a shucking house, and there would have been a line of people just shucking oysters, taking the meat, putting in a jar, fill a jar full of water, seal it up, and then that's what was sold as oysters. They also, usually this was fresh water. So the oysters, you put fresh water in, because they're normally full of salt, they puff up. So you get a fuller jar. And that's why jarred oysters were never quite as good as
How long is that? How long are they good?
Well, they have to be, it has to be refrigerated in, 2 or 3 weeks. They're gonna be put in the jar. They're gonna be kept 33 or 34 degrees, but they're basically, a raw thing in a jar.
Yeah.
So now we're coming back to Humboldt Bay, and this is talking about stingrays in the bay. So in the summertime, we have not stingrays, but bat rays come into the bay here. They're a seasonal thing, and they come in and feed on shellfish in the bay. So this was, I think that was a trap designed to catch bat rays. And so the bat rays would have gone in there, and then these guys would have killed them. And that was kind of that was really a big deal. I mean, still, like if you walk around the bay in the summertime, you'll see these big depressions, maybe a couple of feet in size that form in the bay, and those are for bat rays coming in and feeding. And they just get in there and kind of wallow and make a pit. And if they find an oyster or some kind of a clam or something, they suck it up and crush it and eat it.
What would they do with that rays once they kill them? I mean, did they?
They just sent them to the tallow works.
Really?
They didn't do anything with them. They were just killing them to get rid of the predators, basically. They also, well, besides catching bat rays, they used to catch a lot of like green sturgeon and California halibut. These traps are going to catch anything. So once they eliminated this, like the catch of halibut and green sturgeon in the bay really improved drastically, because these guys were just, like killing the fish that were in the bay for predation control. Did you have a question, or?
Didn't they also do trawls?
Yeah, besides the traps, they had a little trawler and a trawl, and they would just go up and down the channels and trawl them, and whatever they caught was basically dead. And so not only, and they took a lot of green sturgeon. For a long time, the green sturgeon population was really depressed here, and it's only come back maybe in the last 20 years or so. I blame that to the depredation that they used to do out in the bay, because they just kind of killed everything. So here we are, killing some. See, that's a shark in there. I say a cow shark, but that would be like a 7-gilled shark, which are still out in the bay. That's some kind of a big ray there. That's another ray there. So they're really happy.
Question, how effective were the bat rays at predation of oysters?
Well, they were highly, they ate a lot. I mean, that was the whole reason. You'll see they initially used to just have oysters, like they would put out crushed oyster shells and put the oysters on top of them and let them grow on the bottom. So that was like a perfect feeding habitat for the rays. And then slowly they worked in trying to get them up like on the racks off the bottom. And then once they had come up with plastics, they would put them in bags and have the bags suspended up off the bottom.
Sorry.
That's okay.
But also consultation with Humboldt Bay when I was working as a fisheries biologist, and there was a woman named Anne Gray who did her master's thesis on food habits of the bat rays, and she didn't find that they were in the grain.
She didn't find what?
That they were eating that many oysters, that they were eating a lot of other things. I have a copy of it already, but I just remember that was significant, and that I think a lot of it was an assumption. And she actually did some, collecting.
Looked at their stomachs and stuff and see.
But again, it was after they had.
Yeah.
Yeah, because they did the removal for like 30 years or so. I mean, it was like a really, really big deal. And I think it really impacted the fish, the big fish population of Humboldt Bay.
I don't know if she might have used, maybe there was some, I can't remember. Maybe she used some of their specimens too. But it was found, and they were transitioning out bottom culture at that point anyway, so
Hmm.
they were no longer.
Oh, you might have to repeat her comments for the microphone.
Uh-oh.
Shall I?
Sure, I'll let you.
Okay, there's some research noted here that perhaps the predation wasn't as effective as thought. So I guess this would not be the first time in history that people were killing predators on the assumption that they're doing a lot of damage, even if the data shows they were wrong. Yeah, wolves. Okay.
So here's a way of dealing with predation without killing them. So, so this is, I think, still back in the 1950s. So anyway, we got wooden racks with oysters hanging off strings of them. Over here, we kind of have stakes that have been pounded into the ground, and the oysters are connected to those. So all of this is to avoid just the bottom culture and to improve the survival of the oysters. That new Eureka oyster farms.
Do people walk on those boards?
I don't know. They would have been really, well, maybe. Probably slippery and
Yeah.
dangerous to walk. They're probably totally underwater at high tide. So here's some people once again. Oyster shells getting harvested. Here we are out on the mud flats inspecting some oysters. Barges full of oyster shells getting ready to go out into the bay. Here's what it looks like when they spread the oyster shells out on the bay. Instead of being totally muddy, you have oyster shells so you can walk around, and then the upright growing oysters are live oysters. And then here's the shucking house, which was almost all women worked there, mainly Portuguese women, and kind of a great tradition in Humboldt County that not many people know about. But I have a friend whose last name is Pimentel. His mom and all her sisters were all oyster shuckers here.
And then they canned them?
And then they put them in jars, and they didn't heat process the jars, but they kept them refrigerated. So they didn't get cooked. They were still raw in a jar. They were put in a jar and they put fresh water in with them, and then that was how they sold oysters back then. None of this oysters in the shell, oysters on the hassle. It was all a jar thing. Okay, so here's Humboldt Bay oyster beds in 1997. And here we are up here in Arcata, the Arcata channel. But these were all the commercial beds that were probably coast oyster companies. These circles would be they would have a center anchoring point, and so they would anchor there and then work their way out the circle, dredging. And then they would also put oyster shells back into this area. So these were kind of improved areas that they used for culturing oysters on the bottom of the bay. And if you flew over the bay back then, you could see all these circles out in the bay. It's like, no, that's not irrigation. It's oyster farming going on out there. And they used to do that, and someone sued them because they were messing up the surface of the mud flats. So all that kind of culture went away. Stopped doing it because it was ruled illegal. But they did it for 40 or 50 years.
And extensively, I mean, look at that.
Yeah. Yeah, it was, I mean, these were like well-developed areas. They were kind of highlighted by painting them green, but you would be able to see this if you flew over the bay at high tide. You'd see all the circles out there, the oyster culture areas. So anyway, let's see, this is like a 1930s look at the bay and how it was divided up back then. And these were kind of like leased areas. So this was like the Arcata lease area. This was a Eureka leased area, but you can see the bay was pretty well divided up with a oyster culture going on. Trying to see, I can't see the crosshatches, sorry. Yeah. So some of it, there's state plant reserves, state native oysters, diked bed, oyster bays of 1960. So here we are. This is one of the beds. It's actually out behind Braycut. I got a nice sunset picture of it. So these would have been, when this bed was working, there would have been wood around the perimeter, so it would kind of hold water at low tide, probably crushed oysters all through this area, and then they would have oysters growing on the surface of this. This is a walkway to get out there. That's behind Braycut. One of the few places where you can still see the old oyster runs. Or you could when I took this picture. I think the wood in them slowly gets eaten by wood boring organisms, so they're kind of all gone away.
How old was that picture?
How do I go back here? P?
Yeah.
I actually took this picture, so probably in the about late 90s or early 2000s. Here's a healthy stand of oysters. When that bed would have been planted, and you put out shells, baby oysters on them, and they grow up. So these would probably be ready to harvest. That's what the beds look like when they're full of live oysters and not empty. And those would be Japanese oysters or two. Here's oysters growing up on racks. So this is getting the oysters off the bottom. So that culture technique avoids having them on the bottom. You have less trouble with predation. And I think this was previous to plastic. Some of these pictures are, now everything is in a plastic bag that's out in the bay. Before they had plastic, they did other things. Here's oyster in plastic. I think this is Tamales Bay, actually, but you can see just rows and rows of oysters. Kind of a cultural area. There's a bag, what they look like when you get up close to it, an oyster bag, like the ones in the previous pictures. And these are oysters, once again, they're up on sticks, so they're up out of the water, but they're not on bags.
It's like the ropes.
Yeah. Probably ropes going this way between supports, and then the oysters are like strung on, they punch a hole in the shell and put them on the ropes. Okay, well, now this is an oyster hatchery. So, kind of in the old days, there were a few places on the West Coast where oysters would spawn. So the native oyster or Australorida, well, they would spawn up and down the range. But then when people started to culture oysters, they mainly cultured Japanese oysters or Pacific oysters or Crassostrea gaius. And initially, they just found places where they would naturally set, but there weren't very many of them. So like one area was up in Washington State on Hood Canal, kind of the north end of Hood Canal where the Trident nuclear bases. And there was this nice little enclosed bay where the oysters would spawn there. And pretty much that supplied all Washington State with Pacific oysters until maybe the 1960s when they started to have oyster labs like this where they're growing algae here, and then they would have oyster larvae in these tanks, and they would feed the algae to the oysters which are still little tiny microscopic things, and then they would grow up till they got big enough and they put oyster shells in the tanks and they would settle out on the tanks. So this was kind of an early oyster growing setup. Here's the same thing. Here's somebody shucking an oyster, and these are all different. I put this in because you can see all these different colors. These are all different species of algae. They're growing in the tank. So, like this is probably, well, this is Nanochlorus. Some of these others are different species of algae, depending upon the size of the oyster or what kind of algae they feed them would be different. And he's gonna eat one. So this is a Taylor's Seafood up in Washington State. And this is the kind of oysters they grow up there. So they have Pacific oysters, Kumamoto oysters, and Olympia oysters, and that's just their truck with a nice nice pictures of oysters on it, named oysters. This is actually at their facility. So this is big Japanese oysters. That's the size Japanese oysters are when you grow them up and get ready to shuck them. So these are like in baskets, and they're going to go to a shucking station and get shucked from here.
I think you answers my question. So today, is the shucking still done with human hands, or is it mechanized?
No, it's still done by people where it's done. I mean, there's a lot more, like maybe through the 70s and 80s, there was a lot more of shucking and jarred oysters. And now people want, oysters on the half shell. So there's more oysters that aren't shucked, and they just, kind of clean them up and sell them. But this would have been I'm sure this was up in Washington State. This is probably Taylor's Seafood, and that's, a line of shuckers there. So they would be shucking oysters, putting the shells in a bin, and then putting the oyster meats into a bucket to jar them up.
I'm sorry, are there a lot of injuries in this kind of work?
Well,
You're shucking with knives.
you have to know what you're doing. I think it's one of those
Do
things.
they have chainmail gloves?
Usually you'd have one chainmail glove that you'd put on the oyster, and then you'd dig with your other hand. Wouldn't have it, but you'd have the knife in it. So you'd kind of pop them open and sever the muscle in two different places. So that's what those guys are doing. These are just boxes of oysters, probably getting sorted for size and going into those cartons for either shucking or to be shipped. And that's just a picture of looking into one of those boxes of oysters we were just looking at. And these would be pretty big. These would be like 5 or 6 inch long oysters. And these are little native oysters, or Olympia oysters. So they would be maybe 2 inches this way on them. And everybody, all the oyster growers went away from, when they started out in the 1930s and 40s, everything was based on Olympia oysters. And then once they were able to get Pacific oysters, have oyster hatcheries, 95% of the production is all Pacific oysters now, or Kumamoto oysters, which are kind of like pretty closely related to Japanese oysters. I think they're a different species, but I would argue whether they're a subspecies.
And double the size of Olympias, huh?
Yeah, Olympias are pretty small oysters. And Olympias, that was, we had Olympia oysters in Humboldt Bay, and the first ships that came up here dredged them all up and shipped them to San Francisco. Basically, that was what happened to all the oysters in the bays everywhere. And back then they would just ship the whole oyster. They didn't shuck them. And so that ended up taking all the oyster shells out of the bay. So all the oyster populations crashed up and down the West Coast as a result of that harvesting technique. And And so they became relatively rare, and then the oyster industry kind of went away until they got back to culturing the Japanese oysters. They wrote to bring those in and culture them. And that's, what the commercial industry is based on, rather than Olympia oysters or native oysters. Let's see, we're getting near the end. This is just a picture I found of, some old guys standing out there in the oyster flat. I liked how formal they were. And this is boxes of oysters spat on shells coming from Japan on a log boat. So that was how they would ship them. And they would just be on the dock of the boat, and once a day they would hose that down with seawater and keep them alive. And they would make it from Japan to the west coast of the United States like that.
It's quite a journey.
Quite a journey. This is just another shot of some oyster dikes with guys standing on them. And this is a picture taken in Japan of guys who are selling oyster spat on shells. So you can kind of see they have a rope with shells on it. I just put this picture in because they were so dressed up in the picture. I was going like, wow. Back when they were going to take a picture, we're out here doing nasty, messy work, but because we're having a picture, we're going to put on coat and ties and hats. Well, that was remarkable.
Picture doesn't show the smell.
And show smell. Happy Oyster Festival. So that's that was the end. I think I have a couple more.
Fantastic, wow.
Thank you.
I have no idea.
So if you got any questions on,
I can relay questions. I'm by a microphone. Yeah.
So I am interested in what's happening now with the oysters. Where they're culturing them on the bay and what the threats to that. So Hog Island oyster, the place over by the Mather Bridge.
well, are you involved with them or something?
No,
The guy behind you, he might answer that question better than I can.
Oh, it is.
Hey, yeah, he's even got a t-shirt.
What was the question specifically? Just like what's going on with them?
Yeah,
And are they the only one?
oh no.
Yeah, there's a lot of them. They're one of the only ones that has hatchery and nursery. I think one of the other places just started their own hatchery too. Which is the section I have. So like the pictures earlier, it's like, that looks very familiar.
The green tanks of algae. Yeah, you just feed the algae to the oyster.
Yeah. Yeah, when people get it out, work so much easier, so much earlier in the night.
So anyway, to kind of go back to your question, there's maybe, I don't know, a dozen little oyster companies in the bay. There's like Coast Oyster Company, it's still the big company, and they're down in, Eureka is their office, and they kind of had the center of the bay leased, but then there were all little areas around it that other smaller companies have leased. And so there's a pretty, I don't know how many oyster companies are in the bay now, maybe a dozen or something. A lot of little guys.
That's small family ones, so there's a few big.
And then risks with ocean water warming, sea level rise kind of risks.
Well, people were kind of concerned about sea level warming and how it would affect like the calcium carbonate balance of the water and whether that would impact the ability that oysters produce shells, but they seem to be surviving with the water coming up and getting warm. It's probably because, in Japan, they're found farther south than we are here. So, the different species can adapt to warmer waters. Other species are adapted to colder waters.
Yeah, one of the big things that everyone's talking about aquaculture for like the local area is the windmill plan. Because they'll take big ships coming in, which could ruin the Humboldt Bay is like clean record, being disease free, which is what lets us send like oyster spat and seeds and everything across the country to like Oregon, Washington and stuff, because we're considered disease free. It's a bunch of map ships come from across the world to build out you know, the big windmills, then there's a big chance of contamination.
So the big ships would have oysters growing on the bottom of them. And so they would be bringing in oysters from elsewhere that might have a disease that, you know, wouldn't have them.
I wonder about from the big, that was the thing that people were worried about too, but all their effluents going pretty much outside the bay, like a mile out, I think is the current kind of regulations. And theoretically, it shouldn't have any escapees because it's all closed. I think they're going to recirculate with the system and they apparently, I don't know the full details, but there's actually something that is actually helpful for the bay because there's something about taking water out of the bay will keep it less muddy or something. Or I don't know the full details on that part, but I've gone to some conferences talking about it.
So I don't exactly have a memory, but I have a memory of talking about it. The oysters in the early 70s were like bigger, chalkier, different consistency than oysters in the Gulf of Mexico. And now I think that they're, you know, not like that. And so what are these oysters that we're getting wasn't
Well, the bigger ones are probably Pacific oysters or crass oyster, I guess, 'cause they'll get like this big if you let them keep growing.
Oh,
And
you're holding your hands maybe a foot apart?
yeah, this big.
Wow.
Still would get, you know, I.
So are they just bigger than the one, they're just bigger?
Well, they just keep growing, but when they're harvesting them, they don't let them get that big because nobody wants.
Yeah.
I used to call, those are crass oyster gagas. You would gag if you tried to eat them because they're so big.
Big giants.
Wow.
Isn't there a thing where if they get to like sexual maturity, they start tasting bad or something like that?
Well, I've never really heard that, but yeah, and that's part of the thing too, you know, they're probably good in January, you know, during the cold months, they're probably okay, but then the rest of the year, maybe not so good.
I had a question about the algae growing. There were different cultures, different colors of algae. Why? I mean,
Well,
are
those
there,
would be probably all different species, so there's gonna be different sizes, those algae are gonna have a different size. And so the larvae at different stages of development need to have different sizes of algae to eat. So be darned, it's small enough so that they can eat it.
are there nutritional differences between the algae?
Yeah.
Huh.
Also nutrition, like.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not on the algae side, I think there's like at least 4 different species of these permanent weeds around, but they're all brown, so there's not as much color around as that nature had.
Huh.
And they, well, you know, but they filter them and like that picture had some green ones in there. So the green algae are probably gonna be larger in size and then, you know, those might go to larger oysters, whereas the larvae are really small. So they get, you know, algae, they're like one cell algae. What they're eating, those tanks that are all the different colors were, you know, algae that are one cell in size.
So an oyster in the water would just be choosing its food based on size.
Well, they would filter the water and it would kind of come in and go through the gills, and the gills, besides being respiratory, they're going to be sorting the stuff, and that would kind of get pushed down the gills to what I call the palp area. And that's another sorting area where they're going to sort stuff that's edible versus inedible. And edible stuff they're going to eat. The inedible stuff, they make little pellets called pseudofeces when they shoot those out into the water. So they're cleaning the water, not only they're eating it, but just because they filter it. And you know, that's people have always not talked too much, but you know, the oyster filtering of Humboldt Bay probably improves the water quality quite a bit.
Yeah. I've never heard of pseudofeces before. There you go.
Now you know it's not. Because there's a lot of clay and, you know, stuff that they can't eat, so that's all pseudofeces pellets that they shoot out.
And they're on the doors, they shit so much.
They should pseudo species. It's not just. Yeah.
I had a question. You mentioned brooding oysters. Never heard of such a thing. And does that increase the lifespan of the youngsters?
Okay, well, brooding oysters, what I mentioned that, I have to go back and think about this. So there's different genuses of oysters again. So I was talking about there's Crass Austria and Austria are kind of the two major genuses that are used for edible oysters. And the Crass Austria expel their gametes into the water column so that they swim around like the pictures with the rats and the white that was oysters spotting into the water column. But Austria oysters, they retain their spawn inside the mantle cavity. And so they get fertilized in there, and then the little larvae are just held within the cavity. So instead of, putting 10 million larvae out into the water column, maybe you have a couple of 100,000 larvae that live inside the mantle cavity, and they actually stay in there and eat food the adults bringing in until they get big enough to exit out, and then they go out and settle out pretty rapidly. So that's kind of a good thing for like Humboldt Bay. Our native oysters here are an Austria species. And so they would be retained, within the mantle. If they were just out free swimming in the water for 45 days, they wouldn't stay in Humboldt Bay. They'd get, washed out of the ocean and go away because they're kind of held in the mantle cavity. They can grow and mature in there, and then they come out and spawn or settle out relatively quickly.
Do you know how well the native oysters are doing now that everyone's farming like Pacific oysters and other stuff in the bay? Is it an invasive problem, or is it the native species is still doing relatively well?
The native oysters in my time here since the early 1980s have dramatically improved in numbers in the bay. So I think they're doing pretty well. And I find a few when I go out of the Austria edulus, which are the native oysters are Austria lorida. And so that's one of the ones I was talking about is a brooding oyster. Austria edulus is like the European brooding oyster, and some of the oyster growers were growing them to grow them for spat to sell, and a few of them escaped to get out of the bay. So whenever I go out into the bay and visit the oyster reefs, I find Austria edulus, I kill them. It's exotic, but you don't want to have to go with the bay. They get like much bigger. The native oysters are kind of this size, and then the edulus order of magnitude bigger.
And does the brooding account for some of that success with the native oysters?
Yeah,
Particularly? Okay.
that's why even though they grow, a lot of Japanese oysters, the Crass Austria gigas in the bay, and they probably spawn in the bay, but they have such a long larval time that they go out into the ocean. So, if we were in more of a kind of a bay like Chesapeake Bay or something, the Japanese oysters would just cover everything with, larvae that would grow and settle out. But, Chesapeake Bay has a relatively long detention time of water within the bay, where Humboldt Bay flushes like 90 to 95% on each tide cycle. So things that are
That
the
much?
water column get swept out.
Wow.
That's interesting. I'll say that again. So the difference between us and Chesapeake Bay is that it gets flushed out.
Here gets flushed out.
Yeah.
95%.
Yeah. Think of the bay, the mud flats.
Mud flats, yeah.
And there's deep channels, but the majority of the bay flushes on a tide cycle.
Incredible. And do you find that the brooders, I'm kind of stuck on this idea. Do you find that the brooders tend to come from places that flush like this?
Well, yeah. I mean, that's if you look at places where there's Austria species versus Crass Austria species. Usually the Crass Austria are just the free spawners, and Austria are the ones that brood. They they're in similar situations as we have here.
Any more brooding questions?
Elliot's obsessed. No, that was fantastic.
Did we do it? Any more? Any more?
Good.
Okay, thank you.
I'll never eat one again. We talk about.
Just for like a month, I've been doing aquaculture classes at CR, and so during the summer month, I started working with them. I've been working with sunken seaweed for longer than that.
Oh, I was just at the health fest, we went out in Fort Bragg, they had a big health fest, it was really interesting. I went to watch,
It sounds,
yeah, it sounds really
the
cool.
seaweed festival is supposed to be up here soon, which I'm excited
Oh,
about.
cool.
Did you wander over and handle some of the hagfish?
I haven't done the doing.
That's an experience. I accidentally ended up in their parking lot. And I said to the guy, hey, these are hagfish, right? And he says, yeah. And he said, touch one.
I love catfish, they're cool. I did a whole.
Have you ever touched one?
No, not personally, but they're like 61% of all the fish like. South Korea really enjoys them, but doing like dollars for the these artistic extinction.
Yeah.
So what did it feel like, when you touched it?
Well, their natural defense is they exude a mucus that swells up 10,000 times bigger than when they release it. So if they're in their, they're on the bottom of the ocean, if a shark comes by and bites them, they get a mouthful of snot.
Oh,
And it happens so fast that the hagfish actually escape. It gets away. Oh, yeah. Incredible amounts of snot come off of those things. Everybody ought to have that experience.